and welcome to another DCL Learning Series webinar. Today we're talking about clean and complete metadata, which I think is a very main ingredient to a positive customer experience. We're fortunate today to have Alan Porter joining us. Alan Porter is a senior customer experience evangelist at OpenText. He focuses mainly on the OpenText customer experience suite. And Alan is a regular writer and industry speaker on various aspects of customer experience and content strategy. And Alan was recently named one of the top 25 content strategist influencers. I'm Brian Trombley, and I've been with DCL for a number of years now as a sales director, but my background is more in implementing technologies, and I've been dealing with content technologies since the early 80s. I want to spend just a minute or two talking about DCL. Many of you are aware of DCL. Some of you are customers, some of you are potential customers, and some of you may not know about DCL. So just a brief introduction before I hand it off to Alan. DCL's been around for 36 years now. We focus on content transformation and digital migrations. We focus on a lot on XML and HTML. We do ebooks. We do big data automation, some very large projects where we clean up very large corpuses of data or process, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of pages a day for a couple of clients. We offer conversion management, some editorial services, as well as a solution called Harmonizer, which is a content reuse analysis solution. We are based in New York City. We provide world-class services. We leverage technology as much as possible and automation as much as possible for consistency. Our focus typically is on the more complex content situations. We provide our clients visibility into their projects with 24/7 online project tracking. We spend a lot of time focused around automated as well as human quality control. And a couple slides in, I'm sorry, Adam, if you could just go to the logo page there. Just a very few of our clients, probably less than 2% on that slide there. And if you look at the next slide, we span many industries, both in traditional publishing and in what I call accidental publishing, so manufacturers and other organizations that need to produce information as part of their product offering. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Alan. So please, everybody, put your listening ears on because Alan has a lot to say, and I think it's very important. Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for that very nice introduction. I was actually wondering who you were talking about for a second there, but it sounded very good. So this afternoon, really what we wanted to talk about was, Brian asked me to sort of talk about metadata, but I don't think we can really talk about metadata without talking about where it applies, why it's important, how you build a strategy, and how it's actually helping to drive the changing customer experience. So really that's where I'd like to start. So next slide, please. And again, talking about how the customer experience is changing. Next slide. One of the interesting things that I found as I've been doing a lot of research around the evolving customer experience, and it's sort of difficult to believe for folks like me that have been building and around websites since the sort of early 90s, is really there are actually now fewer and fewer websites and fewer website traffic in terms of traditional websites. It seemed to peak around 2010. But since 2010, website traffic is already down around 40%, and I've seen stats that suggest that basically even as soon as 5 years' time or maybe 10 years' time, there will be no such thing as the traditional brochure-type website that we've all been used to for the past 20 years. So things are changing, and where are they changing? Next slide. They're changing because we're going more and more digital. the vast majority of digital interactions now, more and more mobile, the vast majority of digital interactions now really has moved down to mobile platforms. People really want intuitive end-to-end experiences that they can sort of drive just with their thumbs. They don't want to be particularly on a keyboard or a laptop or a desktop machine. They want to be able to do things when they think about it on the device they happen to have. Very intuitive experience. What it means from a content point of view is there's actually less and less space for content, but that content has to be able to grab somebody's attention, engage them quickly, and provide a usable experience. Next slide. The other thing we're seeing is the increase in new technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality. Personally, I have some doubts about whether virtual reality will go totally mainstream, as walking around with a set of goggles on your face is probably not the best thing. But I actually think augmented reality has a huge future in the customer experience and the delivery of content, where we can actually sort of, start getting more and more information layered on top of what we're seeing on our cameras, on our digital phones, or heads-up displays, or whatever is going to be sort of the next generation of Google Glass. For those of us who wear spectacles, maybe we'll get to the point where we can start pulling up, we can look at a building or an object and start getting information about it sort of overlaid on the lenses that we're already looking at. So, I already have heads-up display in my car and stuff like that. So I think we're going to see more and more of that as things are going. And again, in terms of content, it means sort of breaking down content and delivering smaller chunks of content, but each of those little chunks of content has to be more valuable. Next slide. And along with the visual is the increase in more and more artificial intelligence. The number of people who pick up the phone to make a service call is rapidly decreasing. More and more people are using forums or chatbots and automated chatbots to interact with companies. And again, a lot of the traditional content has to be sliced and diced in a way that it can actually feed the chatbots. You will find, actually, next slide. And bringing on, following on from that is the sort of increase in the use of the virtual assistants with audio interactions. The use of Siri and Alexa and Google Now is something that I found myself doing more and more. Is starting a sentence when I'm looking for something with "Hey Siri" and getting the virtual assistant to go look for it. And if we're delivering content, you've got to start thinking again in terms of how can you develop an audio content strategy, and what sort of content do you need to help drive these virtual assistants that we're seeing more and more of. And this sort of technology is going to be built more and more into our day-to-day sort of products. So next slide, please. To the point where you may find yourself talking to your fridge and telling it to go order some more milk, or ideally it actually knows you've run out of milk and has actually already ordered it, and maybe it's at your next grocery drop off. Or actually, just before I started this webinar, I went to get a glass of water, and my fridge was telling me I needed to order a new filter. And the next stage of that is the fact that it would actually automatically know that you needed to order a filter and talk to Amazon, and that filter would just turn up on my doorstep in time. And as I say, we're getting to this connected Internet of Things where we need content to drive it. We need content for the interactions and the customer experience. And we're now at the phase where there's actually more devices connected to the Internet than there are humans, and that's just going to keep going and going. And we're also getting to the stage where there are screens everywhere on everything. I stopped to pump gas yesterday. There's a screen on the gas pump, that's giving me information, trying to sell me advertising, marketing, running quizzes, showing bits of TV. You're on a plane, there's a screen in front of your face. The screens more and more places, including starting to see them on devices like fridges and so forth. So we're getting to the point where we're just going to always have screens in front of us, and those screens need content. Next slide. So like I said earlier, how we can sort of drive this is really, instead of producing large monolithic chunks of content, like when I started in the business, it was all about producing big manuals for big pieces of equipment. But we're really now getting down to the point where we actually, instead of building sort of walls of content, huge walls of monolithic content. We need to actually break that content down into smaller, easier consumed pieces of content. Each of those pieces of content should be able to stand on its own. It should be engaging. It should provide value, but they should also be able to build together and connect together to build a larger picture to help a customer solve a problem or help move somebody along a business process. Next slide. So how do we connect those pieces? Really, we need content. I've already sort of mentioned this. It's all about the content, but to make that content usable, can click, please. We need content, next one, next click, about the content. And that content about the content is what we call metadata. Next slide. So what is metadata? What's a formal definition of what we mean by metadata? So next slide. So I always like this definition that comes from Regina from our friends at Content Rules, that metadata is classifications designed to help you find, retrieve, and use specific pieces of content. Like I said, I like to think of it as content about the content. And often that content about the content is more important or as important as the content that you serve up itself. And there are three particular types of metadata. Next slide. It's information, and again, it could be defined as information that provides information about other data. It's another definition. So there are three distinct types. Next click, please. There is structural metadata. Next one. Descriptive or semantic metadata. Next one. Or administrative metadata. So what are the definitions for each of those? Next slide, please. So structural metadata really is information about the containers that your content or information stands in. They're objects that you can put together. So it could be in a publishing environment, sort of things like, you know, how a page is put together to form chapters. It could be what type of data you're looking at. It could be what version of the information it is, how that piece of information is connected to another piece of information. Really describes the structure of the data. And for those of us used in the content world, this falls very firmly into the idea of structured content and the structure that we put around our documents that actually creates structured content. So next slide, please. So descriptive metadata or semantic metadata really describes information for discovery and identification. It's more human. It means more, if you like, to the human reader, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But it can include elements such as a title, an abstract, an author's name, or keywords, that sort of thing. And the third one, next please. Administrative metadata really provides the information to help the system manage things. So like how and when it was created, when it was last revised, what sort of file type it is, maybe dates and things like that. If you think about just a general Microsoft Word file on your computer, and when you sort of go look for it in the file browser, the fact that you can order on a file, order it by file name or date, really is a consequence of the simple metadata that is applied to that file when you created it in something like Microsoft Word, that it applies 4 or 5 pieces of very basic metadata that allow you to sort it, find it, retrieve it. Next slide. So why is it all important? Next slide. Well, if you've ever done any online shopping, and I'm sure we all have, it's metadata that allows you to basically find the product that you want and have the experience that you need. It's data that really provides things like, for the example here, if you're looking for shoes, you know, you filter by, you know, the shoe size first, and then the style, and then maybe the brand. It's very rarely, unless you're like me and a complete Converse addict, it's very rarely that you would actually start to look for shoes by a brand. You're going to look for something that actually what do they have in my size is probably going to be your first question. So shoe size needs to be a piece of metadata applied to that product, and then the brand and maybe the style and the color and so forth. So everything that you sort of see on a filtered search or that comes up on a shopping website is pretty much driven by metadata. Okay, so next slide. So just sort of to walk through how there's sort of 3 parts of the metadata apply. typically, I was talking earlier about a Microsoft Word file. Typically, a Microsoft Word file is relatively dumb. Most of the content that we look at does not have much intelligence to it. We may be able to read the text in this article and parse it and divine it and understand what it's about, know what the headline is, know who wrote it. This is actually one of my articles for CMS Wire from last month. But we can read it and we can parse it and we can understand it. But as far as the system's concerned, it's just a blob. It's just an object with a file name. And even though the file name has things in it that mean things to us, like what number article this was, where it was going to be published, and what month of the magazine it was actually aimed to be published in, that's all in that file name. But to the system, that doesn't mean anything. It's human readable, but not really machine readable. It's pretty much impossible for the computer to decipher this as anything other than an object with a name that I could maybe sort alphabetically, but that's it. So not really much intelligence there. Can't really use this anyway. So next slide. So what we do, particularly within those of us who are used to working in a structured content environment, is we would actually then take this and break it down, if you like, and define a markup schema and start adding metadata around it. This is an article that contains a heading that has an author, it has paragraphs and the lists within it. If you want to go to the next slide. And then what we want to do is make it smart. We want to start adding more and more metadata about it. So for the article, we maybe want to start putting in metadata around which magazine it's aimed at, when it was written, the heading. We may want to, what are the subject areas that this is covering that's actually in the heading, who is the author, for what does each paragraph talk about at a high level, what is the list talking about. So the inclusion of this sort of metadata really allows us to start getting more and more intelligent and start pulling information and reusing it, making it easier to find, making it easier to search on, and actually starts to make the content smarter, but it also means we can start breaking it easily break it down into those chunks of information I talked about earlier that can connect together, or that you can actually deliver individually on different platforms depending on a customer experience. If a customer's coming in and they just want to, I'm looking for an article about the technology inflection point that I think I remember reading on CMS Wire, they could put those into a search engine and maybe find this quickly, or they could actually go to the CMS Wire website and very quickly go through a faceted search to find it again, or it could be delivered as part of a blog post, or it could be a social media post or a tweet to it, or it could be something again that comes up on a augmented reality screen that applies to something that somebody's looking at. So this really makes metadata makes your content dynamic. It allows for dynamic content assembly really, and to deliver a personalized experience. So really this is what makes metadata that important part of the recipe for customer experience that we were talking about earlier. So next slide. So in summary, I just want to click. Smart content, next one, is structured metadata plus semantic metadata. So really, to me, the whole thing in creating smart content and smart customer experiences is having that correct metadata underneath it. So next slide. So how do you develop, next slide, how do you develop a metadata strategy? Really you have to decide what it is that you want your content to do. How intelligent do you want your content to do? And should each piece of content delivered to be should each piece of content be matched to a business goal? Ideally, it should be. You shouldn't really be creating content without it actually meeting a need somewhere, either a business goal or a customer need. So really, you have to think about what it is that you want your content to do, and then those business drivers will help define the level of intelligence to be added, the amount of metadata to be added, and the rigor that you need to maintain it. How often are you going to review it? How often are you going to update it? And so forth. The caveat to that is, of course, we all want things to be as fancy and as intelligent as possible, but the more intelligence you add to the content, the more complicated the content creation and management of that becomes. And if you're then adding systems to manage and deliver that, that can become equally complex. So there's a trade-off, strategic trade-off of what do you want your content to do, how intelligent do you need it to do that, and then are you prepared to make the investment to actually maintain and deliver, manage, maintain, and deliver that.
Alan, I'm going to spin here
Yeah.
because it's a little conversational a bit. So you can have really great content, but if you don't have metadata that helps people find that content, it's worthless.
Pretty much, yes.
Correct?
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Yep. Okay. Okay. So here's a practical example. So here we have a nice picture of a couple of pieces of construction equipment working. Now, traditionally, on a a web page or whatever, this may be just tagged as just image, which is fine for the sort of rendering engine, and it's probably got the file name or whatever, but it knows it needs to put an image in there, but it knows nothing about that other than the fact it's an image. So I'm going to click the next one. So from you may then want to start adding some basic, if you like, structural type metadata around it, as to, or even descriptive. What sort of image is this? Oh, well, it's a hero shot of our product. It's a product shot. It's clearly been taken on location, so it's a location photograph. These are sort of, if you like, more internal pieces of metadata for the people building the website. Okay, next one. And then you may have some more internal types of metadata around how this was actually produced. Who was the photographer? What is the location? When was it taken? What sort of product type is it? It's a truck and an excavator. So maybe sort of more high-level stuff. But again, this doesn't necessarily help a customer sort of relate to this image or make it available to make sure that the right image is delivered to the right customer in the right environment at the right time. So you might want to put more customer-driven metadata around it. So next, click the next one. So you might want things like product category. So when somebody's actually looking on the website, they may be looking for a large truck as opposed to a medium-sized truck. The specific model, you probably got customers who know exactly what model it is they're looking to buy. What sort of environment in this is clearly sort of a quarry or mining environment, so you may want to sort of tag it as a mining shot, as opposed to a desert shot or snow or something, to make sure that you're not delivering pictures of snowplow to customers in sort of the Middle East or something. So what sort of activities going on, what region, and this is a sort of an interesting one that's sort of come from practical experience before with the product, is tagging it what regions it's sold in, but equally what regions it's excluded in. There could be cultural reasons in the photograph that you actually don't want that particular photograph in a particular region, and I've sort of had that happen before. And there may be customer profile. If your company has actually built customer profiles or personas, there may be particular profiles that image relates to. And again, you may want to add things in like delivery platform, as to what delivery platforms it's suitable for. If it's something that you want on a mobile device or an AR environment or just on the website. So again, this is just sort of a practical example of thinking about what sort of metadata you can add to a simple image to make it more and more useful for this sort of evolving customer experience that we're all going through. So what happens if you all sounds great, but what happens if you actually don't have any metadata? Next slide. So once again, I'm actually going to borrow from our friends at Content Rules, and this is a nice 4-step slide that they put up at a recent conference on how do you get a quick start with metadata. Really sort of get a group together. Don't do this sort of on your own. Make sure that you include the people who own or request or use the content, and it's not just the content authors. Very useful to get input from, if you're doing this across an organization, the other groups in your organization that use the content that you create, be it technical documentation, marketing, service, production, training, whatever. Just get them all together and sort of build out, what are the categories of metadata you want to create, and what sort of are the values that go with that. Create your metadata rules. Again, think about going back to the strategy. What is it you actually want your content to do, and what sort of metadata do you want to capture? And then write out some metadata guidelines, a bit like you'd write out a style guide for documentation. Just write out some metadata guidelines, provide usage guidelines, so people start using the metadata in a consistent way, and start building it in. And again, with a lot of products, sort of media management type products, you can build drop-down menus or selection boxes that just have the predefined metadata fields for people to fill in or select from, but you need the guidelines to be able to build that sort of interface or configure your media management platforms correctly. Okay, so next slide. Oh, sorry.
That number 4 there sounds like a governance model, right? And the
Correct.
rules by which everyone plays. But and maybe we can save this to the end, but enforcing a governance model is sometimes difficult. And I think that's something that really needs to be addressed in metadata, because it does need to be consistent, it does need to be clean, but it also needs to change over time, and that governance model needs to adapt. Maybe we can speak to that later, but maybe you have some thoughts now.
Yeah, very much so. Like I said, it really, one way of sort of applying it and making sure it's consistent is to use, like I said, if you have a media management tool that sort of allows you to configure a metadata menu, is just to have a predefined selection. The worst thing you can do is have free text tagging, because people will just use multiple different names for the same thing. So taxonomy management becomes important behind it as well. But you're right, this sort of thing, and any governance system is not sort of do it once, set it and forget it. You've got to constantly review and fine tune. That just becomes a sort of question of what sort of cadence do you want to do that on, and to what sort of level. So importing data is a, if you are setting up a new content or media management type platform and you want to bring in metadata, where's it going to come from? Sometimes it's actually in other systems, and then just going back to the sort of photography image one earlier on, in my last role, where we actually pulled in information from the company's photography team, a lot of that metadata was actually already coming in from their files, because the cameras capture it. Today's digital cameras tend to capture, even down to geolocation and date and who the photographer was, and they had to have a project number associated with the photo shoot and things like that. So a lot of data, there's probably a lot of metadata that's sitting out there in other systems that you could actually already use and pull in. Again, you need to make sure it's clean and consistent, and work with those teams to see what information they've already got about their files. They may not call it metadata, but they've probably got some. It could be very distant, simple metadata, like I mentioned. Microsoft Word applies 4 or 5 basic pieces of metadata. It's very rare these days that digital files don't have some sort of metadata attached to them. But then you have to make sure it maps with your metadata strategy and taxonomy. And if you have a large amount, get help. I know Brian's helped me in the past with bringing in large amounts of information into new systems to grow new systems quickly. So yeah, importing data, it can seem very daunting, but figure out what your immediate needs are, your medium-term needs, and then sort of figure out your strategy as to what you're going to do first, and then start working that way. So next slide. So one of the things we've touched on a couple of times, next slide, is the fact that your data needs to be clean and concise. I will tell you it won't be, particularly if you're pulling in from other places. And even if you're actually starting from scratch, because if you've got more than 2 people doing it, there will be inconsistencies. Actually, even one person, if they do it over a long period of time, can forget what tag they used or what piece of metadata they used for a similar circumstance if they have large volumes of data. So it will get inconsistent. How do you clean it up? It's like climbing Everest. You do it one step at a time. Don't try and do everything at once. Define what's important to meet your immediate or short-term business needs. The thing is, do you need to get all your product names correct first so people can actually search for your product names and find the right products quickly? If it is, go through and start with that piece of metadata. Do a product model cleanup before you do anything else. Or it might be that it's more around a price, the way things price points or whatever. But decide what's important to you to meet your immediate business goals and start doing that. And then prioritize your fixes. What do we need to do first? How are we going to fix them? Who's going to fix them? What are the rules for fixing it? What are the rules for checking it? And then just do it systematically over a period of time. And again, get help. And by the way, this is actually a friend of mine at base camp at Everest on Wednesday of last week. He's a way more adventurous than I am. But he got help. I mean, there was a party of 15 of them. He didn't get to the Everest base camp on his own. So anything that looks daunting, I think if you take it one step at a time, clean it up, figure out what your priorities are, and then do it systematically, you can certainly help you get there.
I'm going to jump in again because the whole cleanup thing to me is really important. I've worked with a couple of clients recently where they're licensing content, and that content comes with metadata. And I've looked at some of the metadata that comes with that content, and it's some of it is good, and some of it is, where did they come up with this descriptive sentence that doesn't even apply to this image? And then you'll look at the keywords, and some of them will be very good, but then you'll look further in, and some of them will look like they've been derived programmatically from other keywords, but they still don't apply. And what you're mean to trash Getty images, but I've seen some very good images coming from Getty with very good keywords and descriptive sentences, and I've seen some things that are horrendous, and customers have had to spend like half an hour on an image cleaning up the metadata and the descriptive sentence. What is your thought on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, like I said, when you're bringing stuff in from other outside systems, you've got no control over that data, and you are going to get that situation. I know I've been in a couple of like mergers and acquisitions positions before where they've actually put it into the contract that people, the company that's supplying data, or even sort of vendor supplier contracts, that they actually have to put in they put in clauses where the data has to be clean, and if we have to spend more than X number of hours cleaning it up, then we're going to charge you or not pay you or something. That's probably the most draconian way. Sometimes it's just a question of, if you are going to do something, is sitting down and doing a metadata map of, if you've got something called name in your system and somebody else has something called name in their system, is your definition of the word name the same? Because it could be that it means actually two completely different things, and when you pull the data in, it might be technically in the right metadata field, but actually not what you need at all. So sometimes you have to do these metadata mapping exercises as well, just to sort of figure things out. But at the end of the day, sometimes it just does come down to somebody sitting in front of a keyboard and doing a manual cleanup. Sometimes you just can't get around that.
And so with human eyes and human hands on the keyboard, human eyes on the screen, that can become a costly process. And when you look at reducing costs, you tend to look at offshoring. From your experience, has that been a good thing or a questionable thing in some of the projects that you've worked on?
Generally, it's been a good thing. It's helped. Yeah. Getting help with doing that sort of cleanup generally has been very productive. Yeah. Okay, so really, I just wanted to sort of wrap up with sort of 3 or 4 things to remember from what we've sort of talked about over the last 30 minutes. Just a few things to think about, that things are changing, and we really need to be positioned to meet these new customer experience models. And to do that, we need to be breaking our thinking about sort of delivering smaller chunks of content that are easy to find, provide value, and connect to each other. And to do that, we really need content about the content. We need information about that content, and that's metadata. Just sort of try and remember that sort of metadata comes in 3 types. Structured metadata, basically, talking about how the structure of the piece of information goes together. Descriptive or semantic metadata, talking what it's about, and then the administrative metadata that maybe the systems can use. But to really drive a customer experience, we need smart content, and smart content really is a combination of structured metadata and semantic metadata together. And then there's no point in just throwing metadata on files against files unless you actually have a strategy. What is it that you actually want your content to do? Think about that, and take it one step at a time. Don't try and climb Everest in a single leap, because we're not all Superman. So go get help if you need it. And as to Brian's point just now, I've actually found that very productive when I've done that in the past.
Yeah. One thing that I don't think we talked about or touched on is the fact that, while a department in an enterprise, has an opportunity to enhance their content with metadata, but that comes at a cost, and they have to sell that to management and sell the value, and the structured metadata usually is pretty obvious, and the administrative metadata, the descriptive and semantic, there's big investments there. And what I found, even 20 years ago, is not calling it descriptive or semantic metadata. I would urge my clients when they go for budget to call that the money tags. That's the commercial aspect of the metadata. That's what's going to drive a return on investment. And when you start talking about money to people that need to make money, that's a good thing. And, people tend to respond to, okay, well, if we invest here in the descriptive and semantic, that's going to be our real return on investment, or most of the return on investment. Obviously, it has to be structured correctly, and we need the administrative tags, but we also need, and the administrative tags, might feed into a rights and permissions database, and what can we use this content for, that sort of thing. But really, it's the descriptive tags that feed the customer experience, and drive additional revenue, retain customers, that sort of thing.
Yeah, very much so. I think I actually like that money tag. I've got to remember that. I haven't used that before, so I like that.
I've been 17 years, so you can have it now. It's up to you.
Okay, you haven't trademarked it or anything. Okay, yeah, that's very true. That's very true.
I stole it from somebody else, Alan, so you can steal it from me.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I used the, have you ever done any online shopping question earlier on, because everybody shopped online, everybody's used Amazon. So that's, when you talk about how do you sell it, that's sort of the question that I've tended to ask, in front of with an executive or something is, you've done this before, you've been online, you've seen one, how do you think they do that? They do that through metadata and having it correctly done, and understanding, marking it from my customer's perspective as to what this product is. I'm just to one example, one of the companies I work for, I won't say which one, but when I joined, one of the products was only known internally, was only known by the internal engineering name, and that's what they had on the website. And no customer would know what that name was. They didn't appear on Google or anything like that, because none of the information was tagged with the name that the customers use for that type of product. And as soon as we changed it, when we got agreement that we would actually tag it with the if you like, the common slang name for that product that most of the customers would go put into the search bar. As soon as we changed it, we were on the front page of Google, and the online sales shot up because, surprise, surprise, the customers could now find it. So sometimes you have to have those discussions around, yeah, okay, we may call it A internally, but if we really want to sell it, the customers have to be able to find it. And if they call it B, that's what we should be tagging it as. So yeah, at the end of the day, you're right. If you're actually trying to sell this, it really does come down to a revenue generating discussion, and how is this going to actually drive more revenue. and it will.
Right.
Yeah.
Before we move to Q&A, though, and just getting back to what you were just talking about, and customer, we've talked about the customer a lot in the last 20 slides, but I think we should define the customer, because there's the external customer and there's the internal customer, right? And there's value derived from correctly speaking to the external customer, driving commercial transaction or retaining them as a client, and upselling and repeat selling to them. But also the internal customer within the enterprise, being able to find the right information to do whatever they're doing to help drive more revenue or drive more customer satisfaction. And, you know, a lot of times we look at the external customer, but we don't look at the internal customer. Do you have any thoughts on that, Alan?
Yeah, again, it's a very good point, Brian. And, you know, if often these sort of activities, you know, are driven from within one department or one functional group, and you sort of go through this activity to meet your own business needs. But if you do it correctly and you start thinking about it, you can actually open up your content, your images, your text, pieces of text, your videos or whatever, to other people within across the enterprise, and once they start to see value of it, they and again, from personal experience, I've seen this happen, is they will actually want to start using your systems and put their content in, which actually opens it up to a wider audience. You know, one of the more recent ones that I sort of worked on, we put in a digital asset management tool platform, initially just to drive images for the website. Within 18 months, it was being used across the organization, and you know, for like 16 different use cases that we'd never even thought of when we actually put the product in there and actually set up the metadata for it. Again, because people could find the content easier and use it and start to see the value of actually having correctly managed imagery with the right metadata wrapped around it. So yeah, very much so. It can become a great corporate asset, and it also allows people to sort of look at what the content that they've got and think, well, if I apply this sort of methodology to it, can I actually make something that is just sitting in an archive? Can I pull that out and actually start making revenue on that? And I've certainly seen that happen in a couple of cases too. So.
Yeah. And just one more comment before we go to Q&A. So we talked a little bit about, and going back to, I think, the image slide you have where a product's sold and where it's excluded and this and that, but the whole profiling and audience aspect, you know, that's a pretty important thing in the whole metadata realm. You know, who does it apply to and who doesn't it apply to? And in textual content, you know, if I have a very verbose description of something, but I have a more simplified description of something, and maybe someone who's not so involved in the content might need more information, but somebody who's expert in this content just needs brief descriptions and things like that. I mean, there's ways to slice and dice this very, very word I'm looking for, very, very, very deep and wide and narrow and shallow, if you have to, I guess.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on profiling?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can build conditional pieces of text, you know, that, as you said, they may have different sort of, you know, numbers of words or different language or levels of complexity depending on the intended audience, and then put metadata around it as to this, you know, this is intended for this audience, you know, a general audience. This is intended for a learner. This is intended for an expert, and that allows you to actually deliver that personal experience we were talking about earlier. You know, it could be that if you just go through an app and you don't log in, you just get the general text, but once that you log in and it knows you and your profile and says, okay, we know you're an expert in this area. You only need this small chunk of text and maybe, you know, this more complex imagery or something, because we know what level of knowledge you have. So yeah, you're right. The more that you sort of build those chunks of conditional text, if you like, and put the metadata around it, you can deliver a more personalized experience based on somebody's persona or their login or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's a much more positive sort of interaction with the client or the consumer of that content. So, I'll be quiet now, and we can go to questions, unless, Alan, you have a few other points to make, or anything you thought about as you were going through this that wasn't on the slides.
No, we can take any questions if there is any.
Great, great. Adam, do you want to handle the questions?
Sure, Brian, and thank you, Alan, for a very informative webinar. The first question that's come in is, what does all this change in different content delivery platforms mean for tech writers?
Good question. Thing is, for tech writers traditionally, and I started out as a tech writer, and I've been in that field for a long time. So traditionally, tech writers is all about just supporting the product, but and as I said earlier, creating big manuals for big products or whatever. Looking at monolithic documents, if you like. So a lot of this change really means a slight change in mindset and realizing that technical communications and technical documentation can really drive a lot of this new customer experience. I've always said that technical publications is the one part of the company where all the intellectual property comes together. And as technical writers start to understand more around structured content and breaking content down, they're really in a great position to drive this new customer experience in the strategy and adoption of this sort of customer experience and the creation and application of metadata. I actually think this is a great opportunity for anybody who's either in or coming out of the technical writer world to actually be part of the driving force of this change in the way that customer experience is being delivered.
Well, and the tech writer's job is changing, because it really is not just around documenting the engineering aspects and the user aspects of this. I mean, tech writers' roles are changing dramatically, and I think we'll see a lot more of that as we go more mobile. And I truly think that as you said, Alan, we're down to almost no desktop browser-based interaction anymore. People want information when they want it immediately. I talk to my phone all the time. I say hello, Google, at least twice a day, and so yeah, roles and responsibilities are changing, and the thought process has to change about how we deal with content and how we describe our content to our customer. It really is about describing the content, and clearly as possible with specific keywords and categorizations, taxonomies, and it's a different world than when it was you being a tech writer, Alan, and me dealing with implementing technology back in the early 80s. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. The next question is, isn't this a lot of extra work? How do I find the time when I'm already being asked to do more with fewer resources?
Really, it comes down to your strategy in terms of figuring out what the business need is. As Brian talked about his money tags, one way of actually selling this and trying, is to make people realize that it can actually generate more revenue and more investment. But it really comes down to thinking about, if you like, that Everest analogy, figuring out what it is you want to do, taking it one step at a time, and showing maybe incremental improvements. Just as I said, maybe just start with one metadata tag around the product names, and then you can go say, hey, we've reduced the amount of time that it takes somebody to, find our product on our website. It used to take them 4 clicks. They can now do it with a faceted search or something like that. So, figure out what what's going to drive the business needs, what's going to drive the customer experience, focus on those smaller things, get some results, and then take the next step, get some results, and then take the next step. Don't try and do it all at once. Just, take it progressively.
You talk about clicks, Alan, and the difference between, 3 or 4 or 3 or 6 clicks is huge. There's a lot of sites I go on where I get very frustrated and I just abandon, whatever search I was doing or whatever transaction I was doing. And, if you can get there very quickly in a very logical way, customers and prospects are going to stay and complete a transaction. And that's what it's all about. And I think it's incumbent upon the tech author community to drive that message and say, look, everything's changing. We're still writing great content, but the user's expectation of interacting with that content is changing, and we have to do more with that content in terms of tagging and making sure it fits within the taxonomy correctly. And there is a cost. It's a dollar cost, it's a time cost. But there's other areas in the authoring process now where you're saving time and money, and you can't just expect to pull budget out of that group. You still have to fund them, and you have to do it correctly. And I think there's just so much you can do with metadata. And I think a lot of companies understand that. Obviously, Amazon understands that, and the bigger organizations that sell online understand that. But there's a lot of smaller organizations that really need to improve their customer experience, and the way to do that is through metadata, through adequately describing their information, not the information itself, but the interaction with that information through keywords, where a user can find that information 1, 2, 3 clicks, and boom, they've got the answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Brian.
Yep.
The next question has come in. The next question has come in is, can you talk about the difference between a taxonomy and metadata? Is one a subset of the other?
Yeah, I mean, metadata is the way of describing the content. And the taxonomy really is, going back to sort of product models, is making sure that you're using the same name for the same thing throughout the organization. So building a taxonomy is, if for want of a better way, is sort of building the dictionary, or the correct way of defining what those pieces of metadata are going to be. Like I mentioned earlier, you may have two systems that both use a field called name, but what's the definition of name, and what's sort of the approved pieces to go in that, in that field. So the taxonomy is basically coming up with the, if you like, the approved set of words to use, and in what circumstances, and by what, and how are those defined. And then the metadata is really the process of taking those and applying them to the right pieces of information to make those pieces of information useful. Hopefully that helped. But yes, they are related.
Great, thank you, Alan. The next question is, if we won't have traditional websites, how do we post our content?
The million other ways I talked about. I mean, traditional websites are probably going away, but I think last figure I saw, 50 to 60% of stuff is now done through mobile devices, and I think 50% of the stuff done on mobile devices is actually social media. So a lot of companies now use social media as their prime ways of producing content. A lot of the newer companies, new startups don't even have websites anymore. It's all done through social media platforms or apps. And like I said, when we talk about websites, we're probably just talking about the traditional HTML browser-based websites, but you're going to find that there's going to be new ways of delivering things. Like I said, augmented reality, screens on Internet of Things, and who knows what two guys in a garage in San Mateo or Austin are coming up with now that's going to be the next big thing. So the good thing about sort of doing the metadata exercise is, to a large extent, you're also future-proofing your content around whatever platforms are actually going to come up next, because to do it correctly, you want to be doing it in something like XML, which is platform independent, and it doesn't really, you can then take it and deliver it to whatever platforms are around today, whatever will be around in 2 years, or whatever will be around in 5 years. There's still lots of places to deliver and consume content without it being a website.
Great, thanks, Alan. We have 2 more questions. The first of the 2 is, I found that file naming conventions are non-existent, let alone thinking about metadata. Any tips on file naming?
You're getting people to use consistent file names? Yeah, that's that's always a tricky one. Again, it partly comes down to the fact that file naming is free text. Anything that's free text that people can just sort of type in whatever they want is very difficult to maintain. Again, like anything, you have to show the benefit of, if you're setting up a file naming convention, show people why you're setting it up and what value it brings to them, what benefit it will bring to them. Will it make it easier for them to go find things on a corporate intranet if the file naming convention is consistent? So yeah, just show the value in what, why you're doing it and why you're asking people to do things, and just sort of socially reinforce it. Each time you see it not quite correct, just let somebody know in a nice way, and show them the benefit of doing it correctly. So, but yeah, it's not easy. Change management is never easy.
I'll jump in on this, and I think it's more than just mentioning it in a nice way. I think it goes back to governance. It goes back to having a plan. It goes back to say, this is the way we need to do it. Having the correct plan and communicating that this is the way we need to do it, and this is why we need to do it, and we really all need to do this. So, right, it can become a human resource issue at some point if people aren't playing by the rules. But there needs to be a governance model. When you're writing content, you have a style guide, right? And everybody tries to adhere to that style guide. And when you describe things or name things, you need to have a style guide too. And that's basically a governance plan. And it's for the greater good. It's for everybody's good. The internal customer, the external customer, everybody who has to touch that content. If it's consistently named, consistently categorized, consistently tagged with the right metadata, then we've got a pretty good sort of level playing field to work within that set of content and achieve whatever we're trying to achieve out of that content set.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Brian. Our last question that's come in is, what is your advice on updating metadata as our business changes and our customer base, both the internal and external, changes?
Again, it comes down to the governance model that Brian was sort of just talking about. You really need to set up a regular cadence to look at the metadata that you've built. Look at that list of metadata words. That does it apply to maybe you've opened up into a new geography? You need to start putting in some metadata around that, or you've got a new product line, you need to start putting metadata in around that. So really, as part of that governance process, you really need to have a regular review and update cadence as part of that and as part of your strategy.
So Adam, that was the last question you said. I have a last question here, and I'll ask Alan this. So how do you measure the value of a good or a bad job of applying metadata and play that back to management, especially in light of the last question where you have to continually review and refine the metadata? Is there some way, can you tie analytics back, website analytics or other analytics that are coming in maybe from a, maybe it's a retail channel that's not online. How can you sort of take these metrics and apply it back to the metadata and see if you're doing a good job? Have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, part of that comes down, as you said, is actually defining the meta as you sort of putting your strategy and stuff together, and setting yourself some goals and metrics. And I mentioned earlier, it could be we're going to focus on the product names and make sure that somebody can find the product name in 2 clicks rather than 6, or it could be that we want to see e-commerce sales go up on this product, and by doing so we're sort of rearranging the way you find it, and we hope to generate a 20% uplift in e-commerce sales for that particular product line because we've sort of rearranged the way we describe it so it's delivered differently on the website. So yeah, you do need some metrics, and the metrics could be as simple as how quickly can somebody find this in the content management system, or how quickly can somebody who's not used to using the digital asset management system go find the photograph they want to put on the front of a brochure. Did it used to take them three days of digging through corporate archives to find it, or can they now go online and just type in 2 keywords and it's back in 2 seconds or less? So you've got to think about those sort of metrics up front as you're figuring out your strategy and your project as to how you're actually going to measure the success of this, and then measure it and take those results in as part of that that iteration process as you go forward.
Adam, are there any other questions that have come in? We're right on the hour, actually 1 minute past.
No, there isn't. So I would like to thank you, Alan, for a wonderful webinar, and you, Brian, for your insightfulness and your questions. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version of this webinar in the webinar archive section of our website located at www.dclab.com. Our next webinar will be Tuesday, November 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled "The Process Manufacturers Use When Delivering User Manuals in XML," presented by Neve Greenberg, Director of U.S. Defense Development at DCL. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you all. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.